If all of human history were to be evaluated, and every moment of economic ideology and practice were to be evaluated even closer, no other system would have had as large of an impact in such a short amount of time as capitalism. Obviously, Marx and his subsequent contributions to the communist and socialist revolutions and the spread of leftist ideology of the 20th century certainly shaped our global climate for decades. But, in objective review, capitalism has molded the world's international relations and interactions in a previously unprecedented way. So, it stands to reason that you are wondering the most important question to understanding our geopolitical world as it is today. What exactly is capitalism? To begin this video, let's define a few key terms before we continue. The first of these, obviously, is capital. Capital is wealth or property that is owned by a business or a person and can be invested or used to start a business. The next term is market, which is a system or environment in which goods and services are exchanged, typically based on supply and demand dynamics. Supply and demand is the economic model that describes the relationship between the quantity of goods or services available and the demand for them. Prices tend to rise when demand exceeds supply and fall when supply exceeds demand. Profit is the financial gain made when the revenue from selling goods and services exceeds the costs of producing them. Wage is the compensation paid to workers for their labor. Globalization is the process by which businesses, cultures, and economies become interconnected and interdependent on a global scale, often driven by advances in technology and communication. A market is a market in which prices are determined by unrestricted competition between privately owned businesses without interference by government regulation or monopolistic practices. Taking all of these definitions into account, we can better understand what capitalism is. Capitalism is an economic system in which free ownership of the means of production is up to the individual and not the government, and individuals are free to deploy capital however they see fit. In capitalism, the market, their supply and demand, largely determines what goods are produced, how they're priced, and who gets them. The key features of capitalism are as follows: private ownership, market economy, profit motive, wage labor, and minimal government control. Looking at the first of these features, private ownership of the means of production, we see that in capitalism, productive assets such as land, factories, tools, infrastructure, natural resources, and intellectual property are owned by individuals, private companies, or shareholders, not by the government or the community at large. This system offers great freedom to the individual owner, as owners make decisions about how these assets are used completely of their own volition. They keep the profits or suffer losses from their use, and they can buy, sell, lease, or invest the property as they see fit. The next feature we'll be looking at is market economies or free markets. Capitalist economies rely on voluntary exchanges in markets where goods, services, and labor are bought and sold. Prices are set through supply and demand, not by central authority. If demand increases for a product, prices typically rise, signaling producers to make more. If there's too much supply, prices fall, and producers may cut back. The next feature we'll be looking at is profit motive. Businesses exist to make a profit, and it's both a goal and a measure of success. In a capitalist economy, where consumer choice, the offering of a wide variety of different goods tailored to different needs and budgets, is so prevalent, it is important for businesses to try and stand out and increase their profit in an ever-competitive market. So, we see the profit motive being the incentive for innovation, which allows for the flexibility of capitalism. The next feature we'll be looking at is wage labor. In capitalism, most people do not own productive assets, so they must sell their labor to earn money. This is called wage labor. In the labor market, wages are determined by supply and demand, such as a worker's skills and availability. Employers aim to get the most productivity for the least cost, and workers are expected to be flexible and compete for jobs. The impacts of a wage labor market are as follows. Workers have enhanced mobility and are able to change jobs or careers to pursue better pay, but that also comes with a power imbalance. Employers usually have more bargaining power than individual workers, not to mention the setting up of class structures, as society is often divided into capital owners, the capitalist class, and workers, the working class. This situation, naturally, creates a lot of tension. Labor unions and labor laws emerge to correct abuses such as child labor and unsafe conditions that emerged during the Industrial Revolution and the true boom of capitalism across the world. Tensions also arise due to the growing automation and globalization that is occurring around the world in relation to our labor markets. Workers are finding themselves out of jobs as most labor is shipped off overseas, as employers aim to get the most productivity for the least costs, as we said before. The final feature we'll be looking at is minimal government intervention. Capitalism ideally minimizes the government's role in economic life. The state's job is to protect property rights, enforce contracts, and maintain law and order, not to run businesses or set prices. Although total free market capitalism is hardly ever practiced in the world today, this ideology, laissez-faire, is rooted in the belief that free markets lead to efficient resource allocation and innovation while also promoting individual liberty. However, most capitalist economies today have regulations to protect consumers, workers, and the environment, with governments taking on a more hands-on approach. This is called regulatory capitalism. Some systems, such as Sweden and Germany, have something called welfare capitalism, which mixes capitalism with strong social programs. Nearly every country in the world today practices capitalism in some form, but how it's implemented varies widely. From free market capitalism to regulated capitalism to state-led capitalism, most modern economies are actually mixed economies, combining capitalist markets with some level of government intervention. Now that we have gone over the key features of capitalism, we must discuss the different forms of capitalism that we see across countries. The first we'll be touching on is free market capitalism, which, as we discussed before, has the key traits of low government regulation, emphasis on individual entrepreneurship and private business, and lower taxes and weaker social safety nets. An example of a country that still mostly follows free market capitalism is the United States, with one of the most market-oriented economies. The United States has a strong private sector with relatively light regulation, and while the government does intervene in key sectors such as defense and healthcare, the market dominates most areas. The government only intervenes in healthcare via Medicaid and Medicare in the United States. Healthcare is not free, and what differentiates the United States from a more mixed economy from a freer market one. The next form of capitalism we'll be looking at is regulated or social market capitalism, which has the key traits of private ownership with strong government regulation, comprehensive welfare systems such as education, healthcare, and unemployment benefits, and wealth redistribution via taxes. Examples of social market capitalism in the world today are Germany, which combines capitalism with worker protections and strong social safety nets. Nordic countries such as Sweden, Norway, and Finland are also very prominent examples of regulated capitalism. These countries are defined by high taxes, generous public services, but also a thriving capitalist economy. The next form of capitalism we'll be looking at is state capitalism, which has the key traits of the state owning or controlling major industries or strategic sectors such as energy or finance. Profits go to the state, but there's still a market economy and private enterprise, and the state intervenes directly in economic planning or investment. Examples of state capitalism will be China. China has a blend of authoritarianism and capitalism. The Communist Party of China controls politics, but the economy is highly capitalist in function. State-owned enterprises dominate sectors like banking, energy, and infrastructure, while private tech companies like Alibaba or Tencent compete globally. Russia is also an example of state capitalism. While Russia is capitalist in structure, it is also oligarch and state-controlled. Key sectors such as oil, gas, and defense are controlled by the state or Kremlin-aligned elites. Market freedoms exist, but political powers dominate economic outcomes. The final form of capitalism we'll be looking at is developmental capitalism, which key traits are defined as the government guiding economic growth through targeted investment, industrial policy, and export strategies. It focuses on national development, often at the expense of labor or environmental concerns. An example of a country that follows developmental capitalism would be Singapore, which is highly capitalist and pro-business, but with active state involvement in housing, healthcare, and key sectors. It is often ranked among the most business-friendly countries with high levels of state-owned enterprise control. Now, to bolster our understanding of capitalism, it is most important to chart the history of the economic system from its earliest beginnings to the present day. Although the first use of the word capitalism did not appear until 1850 by French socialist Louis Blanc, the practice of deploying capital has existed far beyond that. The earliest instances of capital can be traced back to medieval Europe during the 15th century. Although feudalism largely ruled the system of economics 500 years ago, the profession of merchant is where historians have found the earliest examples of capitalist practices. Merchants accumulated enormous amounts of money as they worked, being one of the most profitable professions of the times. Merchants would buy goods from producers, market and sell the goods, and thus turn profit. As merchants worked, they built up more capital, eventually allowing some merchants to source their own products. cutting out the middleman of distribution, that is, the producer of such goods. This practice, aimed at the goals of profit, is inherently capitalistic, but during the times of medieval Europe, these practices were heavily frowned upon. In the time of 1400s Europe, religious customs and practices were all but the norm in every house, and the act of wealth hoarding as a Christian was appalling and a sin itself. As stated in the Bible in verse of Matthew 19:24, "Against I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God." This heavy Christian sentiment saw many merchants foregoing their wealth, usually in the form of charitable donations as a form of penance, similar to the practices of noblesse oblige that appeared in 18th century France. Mercantilism grew, and globalization increased due to the discovery of the Americas and the subsequent Columbian Exchange. We see the emergence of joint stock companies, such as the Dutch East India Company, emerging, pooling investor money for larger ventures and expanding capitalist practices across the world, seizing more productive assets. Urbanization of the times also began to erode feudal systems, creating a growing wage labor force which would eventually result in the mass expansion of capitalism during the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, which began around 1750 in Britain and lasted all the way up to 1900, transformed production. Factories, machinery, and mass labor replaced artisanal work. Capital accumulation accelerated. Owners invested in factories and profited from labor, while many workers lived in harsh conditions. To understand why capitalism absolutely boomed during the Industrial Revolution, we have to look at what the Industrial Revolution brought that specifically fueled the gears of innovation and competition. The Industrial Revolution introduced machines like the steam engine, the spinning jenny, and the power loom, which massively increased productive efficiency. Entrepreneurs and capitalists invested in these machines to gain a competitive advantage and higher profits. This created a feedback loop. More investment equaled better machines, which equaled more goods, which equaled more profits, which equaled more investments again, and the cycle continued. Capitalism thrives when there is a return on investment, and the new tech gave huge returns. As efficiency grew, so did the ability to produce. Factory systems replaced small-scale production. Work shifted from small, home-based shops like cottage industries to large-scale factories. Capitalists owned the factories, and workers became wage laborers, selling their time for money. This created a new working class, the proletariat, and a distinct owning class, the bourgeoisie. This wage labor system is a defining feature of capitalism, and the Industrial Revolution locked it in as the dominant mode of production. With better technology increasing production and creating a surplus of goods needed to be sold, capitalists looked beyond local markets and expanded their views to national and global markets. Colonial empires provided both raw materials and new customers, helping capitalism grow global. The need to find new markets drove imperialism, global trade networks, and capitalist expansion. This is what was most responsible for the scramble for Africa, which began in the 1800s. As profits grew, these profits from industrial production were reinvested, leading to capital accumulation. One of capitalism's finest engines, banks, stock markets, and joint stock companies grew to manage and fuel this investment. Credit and finance systems allowed even more capital to be deployed. Capitalism's financial institutions evolved alongside industry, enabling long-term planning and large-scale projects. Workers moved from rural areas to cities, and they became dependent on wages. Factory work requires discipline, routines, and productivity, ideal conditions for capitalist-labor relations. Urbanization concentrated both labor and consumers in cities, supporting industry and commerce. A large, cheap, urban labor force made it easier for capitalists to scale operations quickly. The Industrial Revolution also saw great legal and political support, fueling the gears of capitalism. Governments such as Britain passed laws that protected private property, enforced contracts, and suppressed labor unrest. Policies favored free trade, deregulation, and infrastructure investment, all supporting capitalist growth. Now, as capitalism left the Industrial Revolution, we see the rise of modern or corporate capitalism. Governments began regulating markets more actively, especially after the Great Depression, giving rise to mixed economies with welfare states. After World War II, capitalist economies grew rapidly, especially in the West, while communist economies formed a global rival bloc during the Cold War. Since the 1980s, neoliberalism, deregulation, privatization, and free trade has shaped global capitalism, especially in the US and UK. Globalization has extended capitalist production and markets across the planet, bringing both prosperity and inequality. Modern capitalism is a highly evolved and globalized form of the capitalist system, shaped by technological advances, international markets, corporate power, financialization, and varying degrees of government involvement. It's no longer just about factories and trade, it's about data, finance, branding, and digital platforms. There are many areas that define modern capitalism today, the first of which is corporate capitalism, in which the economy is dominated by large multinational corporations rather than individual entrepreneurs. These companies have vast influence, controlling supply chains, media, and labor across the globe. Shareholders, not individual owners, now often own companies, leading to a focus on short-term profits and stock prices. Examples of these corporate entities would be Amazon, Apple, and Coca-Cola, as they operate in dozens of countries, influence politics, and shape consumer behavior. The next area that defines modern capitalism is globalization, in which goods, services, labor, and capital flow across borders in tightly interconnected global economies. Corporations outsource production to lower wage countries, seek the cheapest labor, and tap into global consumer markets. This has created wealth in some areas, but also deindustrialization and job insecurity. A smartphone might be designed in California, assembled in China, with parts from Korea, Taiwan, and Europe. Financialization also plays a huge role in modern capitalism. The financial sector, such as banks, hedge funds, private equity, and stock markets, play a central role in modern capitalism, as many corporations make more money through financial instruments and speculation than from producing actual goods. Households are now financialized too, through mortgages, credit cards, student loans, and retirement investing. Now that we've looked at the total history of capitalism, it is now important that we look at the key contributions and pitfalls of the economic system. The first contribution of capitalism in the history of the world that we'll be looking at is unprecedented economic growth. According to World Bank data, global poverty has decreased dramatically in capitalist economies, especially in the last 50 years. Between 1990 and 2020, over 1 billion people escaped extreme poverty, mostly in capitalist systems like China and India. Next contribution is innovation and technological progress. The profit motive encourages competition and innovation, and capitalist economies have been responsible for nearly every major technological advancement, such as electricity, the automobile, the internet, medical breakthroughs, and more. The next contribution we'll be looking at is consumer choice and individual freedom. Capitalism creates vast consumer markets and product variety, and people have freedom to choose what to buy, where to work, and whether to start a business. Unlike command economies, capitalism is decentralized, and decisions are made by millions of people and firms. The final contribution we'll be looking at is globalization and international trade. Capitalist systems have connected the world through trade, investment, and technology, and developing countries can tap into global markets, though not always equally. An example of this are East Asian economies, like South Korea and Taiwan, who used export-led capitalism to rapidly industrialize. Moving on from the contributions of capitalism, we now focus on the criticisms, the first of which being economic inequality. Capitalism often leads to wealth concentration. Those who own capital gain more, while wage earners lag behind. This creates class divisions and undermines social cohesion. In the US, the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. The next pitfall of capitalism that we'll be looking at are boom-bust cycles and instability. Capitalist economies are prone to recessions, depressions, and financial crises. Speculation, bubbles, and unregulated finance can lead to systemic collapse. The 2008 financial crisis wiped out trillions of dollars in wealth and triggered a global recession, further highlighting the dangerous pitfalls of boom-bust cycles that are present within the capitalist system. The next pitfall is the exploitation of labor. Without strong protections, capitalism incentivizes low wages, long hours, and poor conditions to maximize profit. Historically, this led to child labor, sweatshops, and union suppression. The labor movements and government intervention were needed to correct many of these abuses. Another pitfall is environmental degradation. Capitalism treats nature as a resource for profit, often ignoring long-term ecological costs. Climate change, deforestation, and pollution are direct results of industrial capitalist practices. Externalities, like pollution, are not priced into market transactions without regulation. The final pitfall and most philosophically debated aspect of capitalism is the commodification of everything. Capitalism tends to turn all aspects of life into commodities, whether it be education, healthcare, or even personal data. Critics argue this dehumanizes society and prioritizes profit over well-being. To conclude with our final thoughts on the economic system of capitalism, we must preface by saying this. Capitalism is not inherently good or bad. Like all other economic systems, capitalism is a tool, and it is up to the government and the form that it takes in order to decide how capitalism will be regulated.